Brittany and Sarah were walking down the promenade, laughing contagiously, throwing jokes at each other. The two friends were in a wonderful mood, so they wanted to share their joy with everyone they met on their way. And how else would they feel, being 15 years old when life seemed so predictable and easy to understand? The girls liked to take strolls on the promenade, looking at the dark waters of the majestic river and imagining themselves as masters of their own fate. Passers-by looked at the young giggling girls with obvious disapproval and tried to avoid them. And only one person dared to appear in their path, unwilling to step aside and give way. It was an elderly fortune teller named Louisa. She always took up the same spot on the promenade, luring trusting passers-by for fortune-telling. This was Louisa's main source of income, which meant that she was great at getting into people's heads, or so Brittany thought. Sarah, on the other hand, was somewhat wary of such things and preferred to refrain from discussing the old psychic and her craft. "Should we go and ask her to tell us our fortunes? What do you think?" Brittany asked with a smile. Sarah looked anxiously at her friend. Was she joking? She wasn't the kind of person to want her fortune read. Sarah knew that Brittany didn't believe in such things. Why would she want to have anything to do with it then? Sensing interest in herself, the elderly fortune teller perked up and started beckoning the girls towards her with enviable zeal. "Come over, girls. The first round is free, and if you come back for a second reading, I'll give you a discount." The girls stopped a few yards from the fortune teller and began whispering to discuss their next steps. "Well, what do you say? Are you going to do it or are you scared?" Brittany prodded her friend again. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but then shrugged and headed towards the fortune teller with an impassive look on her face. But Brittany outpaced her and was the first one to extend her hand to the fortune teller. Louisa smiled, but didn't comment on what the girls did and simply began to examine her palm. The multiplying wrinkles on the fortune teller's forehead made it clear that her brain was processing a lot of information at that moment. Although Brittany didn't believe in such things, even she fell silent and patiently waited for the procedure to end. Finally, the woman pulled away from the girl's palm and said in a foreign, slightly harsh voice, "Don't rush to get married, dear. Wait until you're about 25, then you can go for it. But not before. Remember, it's important. Now go. I have nothing more to say to you." Brittany snorted in disappointment and stepped aside with a displeased look on her face. After all, she had hoped to hear something else, something more interesting and optimistic. People are probably right when they say that all fortune tellers are just charlatans. They know human psychology and use it in whatever way they can. Meanwhile, the psychic smiled at Sarah and asked in a soft, insinuating voice, "Well, dear, will you show me your hand now?" The girl swallowed nervously, ran her tongue over her dry lips, and whispered, "All right, let's do it. I don't mind." The fortune teller squinted at the girl's open palm, then recoiled abruptly and began gasping for air like a fish out of water. What's wrong with you? What is it?" Sarah asked anxiously. The fortune teller ignored the girl's question and asked to see her palm again. This time, however, Louisa was ready and didn't react as violently to what she saw. After chewing at her lips for a second or two, the psychic announced her verdict. "Severe trials await you in life, dear. And how you perceive them will determine your fate. I'll tell you just one thing. Beware of red cars. Get into one, and you will never rise again." The fortune teller's words were so sharp and heavy that they made Sarah jump aside in fright. "Let's go, forget about her. She's probably crazy," Brittany whispered, grabbing her friend's hand. The psychic laughed in a low, chesty laugh, indicating that she had said her piece. And whether to believe it or not was for them to decide. All Brittany did on their way back was criticize the fortune teller. Who does she think she is? Does she think it's funny? Don't marry until you're 25. Don't get in a red car? Is this a joke? Sarah just shook her head. Truth be told, the woman's words had touched the most painful strings in her soul. Why did she say that? What if she really could see the future? No one could answer that question. Only relentless time could eventually put everything in its place. However, just a few days later, the friends forgot all about their encounter with the fortune teller and returned to their carefree life. And only Louisa knew that she had told the girls nothing but the truth. She didn't do it because she hoped they would return, but she valued her gift and never defiled it with lies. 10 years had passed. A lot had changed in the lives of Brittany and Sarah during that time. As expected, neither of them took the words of the elderly psychic seriously. Why would they really believe some crazy street fortune teller? They were sure she used the same script over and over again to get the gullible people to pay her as much money as possible. Brittany got married at 22 and was on cloud 9 with happiness at first. But 2 years into the marriage, it turned out that the young woman's happiness was only temporary, as her husband wasn't actually as loving and caring as in the first days after the wedding. Can you believe it? Josh lost a huge amount of money in poker again. And that's while we still haven't paid off our previous debts, Brittany complained during a phone call with her friend. Sarah frowned, but chose not to remind her friend of the fortune teller's prophecy. Instead, she changed the subject, hoping to cheer Brittany up. I'm going on a hiking trip to the mouth of Green River. Forests, shipping, campfires, and tents. It's gonna be amazing. Yeah, amazing. Don't forget about the mosquitoes and all the creepy crawlies like snakes and lizards, Brittany countered. She never enjoyed spending time out in nature and preferred the comfort and coziness her own apartment offered. Sarah prepared for the trip very responsibly. She packed her backpack and checked the first aid kit. She always did this, as she was well aware that anything could happen on the road. But when the guide picked up Sarah in a green Chevrolet SUV, her mood improved noticeably. All she cared about was that the car wasn't red. Despite her overt criticism of the fortune teller's words, Sarah tried not to ride in red cars. Why tempt fate unnecessarily, especially since it had already proven the power of prediction with Brittany's example? After all, the psychic had warned her about the danger of early marriage, but she didn't listen and took her warning lightly. Having gotten into the passenger seat next to the driver, Sarah leaned back and closed her eyes. Since the trip was going to take at least 3 hours, she hoped to use the time wisely and get some good sleep. Half listening to the conversation of the driver and the hiker sitting in the back, Sarah smiled and thought about something of her own. Everything was going well until the moment when Sarah learned that the Chevrolet she was in had recently been repainted into a different color. Sarah's palms suddenly became sticky and her lips started trembling treacherously. And what color was the car before? The driver smiled. Red, but that's a rather feminine color, don't you think? I prefer green. And this paint is of very good quality, several times better than the factory paint. Sarah's heart was ready to leap out of her chest when she looked at the road and saw a truck rapidly approaching their car. Unfortunately, the driver noticed the danger too late and couldn't avoid the collision. The impact sent the Chevrolet flying into a ditch, where it rolled to the bottom of a ravine. Rescuers had to use hydraulic tools to extract the injured people from the cabin. But Sarah didn't remember any of this, as she fell into a coma after the accident and spent about half a year in it. Waking up was painful and extremely unpleasant. At first, she walked down a dark corridor with light at its very end. Then she heard the voices of the medical staff and the beeping of various sensors that reacted to her coming out of the coma. The white walls of the ward blinded her, forcing her to close her eyes once again. Where am I? What happened to me? Sarah wanted to say, but instead, only a faint wheeze came from her chest. Quiet, dear. Save your strength. You'll need it, the nurse said, smiling encouragingly. 2 days later, Sarah learned that she had a compression fracture of the spine. It sounded like a sentence coming out of the doctor's mouth. Never before had Sarah been so scared as she was then. What could she do? Where could she turn for help? And could she even be helped at all? Sarah looked hopefully into the doctor's eyes and realized that nothing good awaited her in the future. Her fears were confirmed by the wheelchair standing next to her bed. Sarah spent about 2 months at the hospital, but she still couldn't leave it on her 2 feet. The doctors shyly averted their eyes, understanding that words had no power in such cases. Brittany brought Sarah a bouquet of white roses when she was finally getting discharged from the hospital. But the gift only brought an ironic smile to Sarah's lips. She had lost faith in everything in her life, and especially herself. Having come home in a wheelchair, she became a recluse and hardly ever left her room. Where would she even go? To the artificial lawn in front of the house and back? Quite a journey, of course. Brittany came to visit her friend almost every day, trying to support Sarah as best she could. Listening to her lament about her unsuccessful marriage, Sarah sighed sadly, acknowledging the truth of the fortune teller's words yet again. You know, the psychic is still working on the promenade. Sure, she aged a lot, but she still does her readings, and she's never short of clients, Brittany mentioned casually. A spark of hope appeared in Sarah's eyes. So, Louisa's still there, on the promenade? Could you help me go see her? Brittany frowned, but she couldn't say no to her sick friend. The next day, the friends arrived at the promenade. Turning the wheels of her wheelchair, Sarah desperately scanned the area for the elderly psychic. But the fortune teller was nowhere to be found. The woman's disappointment knew no bounds. Just as she had decided to go out and see Louisa, the old woman mysteriously disappeared. And when the women were finally about to return home, a familiar, slender figure appeared in the distance, dressed in a characteristic bright-colored dress. Upon seeing the fortune teller, Sarah began to spin the wheels of her wheelchair with all of her might, wishing to be the first to get to her. Louisa didn't recognize Sarah, but she immediately remembered the lines of fate on her palm, which made the fortune teller feel a chill inside. You've already come to me before, dear. I advised you to stay away from red cars, but it looks like you didn't listen to me. Tears sparkled in the corners of Sarah's eyes. Yes, you're right. I came to you before, and I got into an accident in a red car. Louisa nodded sympathetically, trying not to notice the painful twinges in her heart. At that moment, she truly wanted to help this unfortunate woman whose life had gone awry after the trip in a red car. Looking at Sarah's palm again, Louisa said, You know what? There's still a chance for you. Don't lose hope just yet, okay? There's a medical institution in our city with a red roof. A man with blonde hair works there. He is the one who will help you. I can't say more, I'm sorry. Don't come again or you'll lose your chance at happiness. Sarah didn't understand what the psychic was trying to tell her and only found the building she described 2 weeks later. It turned out to be a newly opened medical center for patients with musculoskeletal injuries. Having enrolled in a course of physical therapy, Sarah saw that the specialist there was a blonde young man named David. Smiling at the thought of the psychic's prophecy, Sarah did her best and took physical therapy very seriously. The woman had to go through a lot before she could take her first independent step. David was by Sarah's side all this time, and eventually, a passionate relationship flared up between them. Watching her friend's success, Brittany caught herself thinking that the elderly fortune teller was right, especially after she divorced her husband and started a relationship with a new man. Only now, Brittany was 27, so there seemed to be no more obstacles to her personal happiness from the whims of fate.